Hey guys, welcome to another video on C programming language. In today's video, we'll be taking a look at relational operators. What is a relational operator? A relational operator is a programming language construct or operator that tests or defines some kind of relation between two entities. Now, what this is telling us is that we need to have two entities, like two variables. Then this operator called relational operator will now check if there is any kind of relationship between this variable and the other variable. Now let's dive into our code and see how it's been done. There are 6 types of relational operators. The first one is the equality operator, the not equal operator, the greater than sign operator, the less than sign operator, the greater than or equal to operator, and the less than or equal to operator. So we will start from the equality operator. Now let me give a comment. Relational operator. So we'll be looking at the equality operators, which is the two equal sign. Let me remove these brackets so that it's not confuse you. Then after that, we will look at not equal operator. Then after that, we now look at the greater than sign. After that, we look at the less than sign. Then we now follow it with greater or equal to, and also we now look at less than or equal to. So let's take the first one. Now remember when I said that you have to have two variables. Actually, you have to have more than one variables. Do you get? So it may be 2 or 3 or 4 variables. Okay, so let us, for this class, we will limit it to 4 variables. But first, we have to deal with 2 first of all. Then we now progress to 3, then 4. You can use these relational operators to validate like 5, 10, 20 entities. Okay, let's continue. Now I'm going to declare a type of int, and it's going to be I'm going to call it number one. Then I'll give it a value of 10. Then another int, I will call this number 2. I will give it a value of 11. We will be working with this relational operator, which is the equality sign. Double equal sign means equality. Okay, so I'll be using a decision making statement, which is the if statement and else statement. So if you do not understand the if statement right now, we will still go to the condition making statements, which are the if else statements and else if statements. Okay, but I will try to explain the if statement here alongside the relational operator. Now we want to check if this number 1 is equal to number 2. So for us to do that in C, we write if, then we open a bracket and close it. Inside of these 2 brackets, we type in the first operator. Remember I said that before you can use these relational operators, you need to have 2 or more variables. Okay, so we have 2 variables here. Then we can work with these operators here. So if 1 is equal to number 2, then we will print to the screen number 1 is equal to number 2. Okay, but if it is not equal to, Then we are going to print. Let me copy this print statement here. We will print number 1 is not equal to number 2 is not equal to number 2. So this is the conditional making statement, this if statement. Now what this if statement does is that it checks whether if this condition is true. Now if this condition is true, this statement here is going to run. Now the if statement starts from here and ends here. So if anything here, this is what we call condition. Now we are giving it a condition using this relational operator. Now we are now saying that if there is a relationship, like if this number 1 is equal to number 2, which if it is true, this is going to print. But if it is else, if it is false, this is going to print. So inside of this place, let me put a comment, only prints when true. And here, this else statement only print when false. So this else statement, you can see it as an alternative to this if statement. So if the if statement is not true, then the alternative, which is the else statement, which I call a false statement, will be printed out. This code inside of it is going to be printed out. So this if statement starts from here and ends here, while the else statement starts from here and ends here. If this condition is true, again, this will be printed out. But if it is not true, this will be printed out. Let's run our code. Okay, you can see here that number 1 is not equal to number 2. So let's go and check which statement printed this message out. You can see is this this else statement. This else statement says number 1 is not equal to number 2, which is what we got on the screen. That means this condition here is false. And you can see here that this number 1 is 10 and number 2 is 11. That means this equality sign didn't give us a true value. It gave us a false value. And when it gives us a false value, it will go to this else statement and print. Now let us change this to 11 so that it will give us a true value. So right now, number 1 is equal to number 2. Now number 1 is 11 and number 2 is also 11. So when we say if number 1 is equal to number 2, so if this guy is true, this is going to be printed out. If it is false, if the number 1 is not equal to number 2, then this false will be printed out. Let's run the code again. Now you can see number 1 is equal to number 2. So this condition here came out successfully. That is why this guy printed out. Okay, so it's just like everyday saying that we normally say that, for example, if you did not want to come, else stay in your house. So that means the person that you are making the sentence to now will be like, okay, I want to come. So that means that statement that you made, if you do not want to come, okay, will return true because the person will come. Okay, but if the person doesn't want to come, then the else statement, which you will say, okay, then stay at home if you do not want to come. Do you get? So the person will now stay at home. It's just the same thing with what we are doing here in programming. If the if is true, any code blocks that we put here, anything we put inside of this place is going to run. But if this if is false, then this else is going to run. As you can see right now, when number 1 was 10 and we use this equal sign which gave us false, this else printed. But when we used 11 11 which is equal to each other, then this prints number 1 is equal to number 2. So that is what this equal sign does. It checks the relationship, whether they are the same, whether they are equal, equality sign. That is what the two equal sign means, equality. Okay, now let us go to not equal to, which you remove one of the equal sign, then put this exclamation mark. This exclamation mark says not, which is the opposite of is. Okay, not equal to. So when you see this exclamation mark, it's just the opposite of equal to. Okay, now when we say number 1 is not equal to number 2, now having number 1 having 11 and number 2 having 11, definitely this is going to return false, because here number 1 is 11, number 2 is 11. Okay, but here you are checking whether if number 1 is not equal to number 2. So after everything, this is going to print out number 1 is not equal to number 3. Let us try and see whether we are correct. You can see number 1 is not equal to number 1 is not equal to number 2. So this statement here, this else printed out. But if you now change this to 12, that means number 1 is really not equal to number 2, because number 1 is 12 and number 2 is 1. So this will evaluate to true, and when this evaluates to true, then this is going to be printed out. Let's try it again. Now you can see that number 1 is equal to number 2, and which block of code has that is this if statement. Number 1 is equal to number 2. So this says not equal to. Okay, you should not forget the exclamation mark plus the equal sign means not equal to. So only this means not. Okay, in programming, only this means not. Then if you now add this to it, is going to be not equal. So you are saying that is number 1 not equal to number 2? This is a question. Is number 1 not equal to number 2? So if number 1 is equal to number 2, this is going to be printed out. If number 1 is not equal to number 2, this is going to be printed out. But if number 1 is actually equal to number 2, this is going to be printed out. So just if you don't understand this, we will still get to the if statement condition. Then I will explain again and again on how this works. Okay, that is just that for this not statement. Okay, now the next one is going to be the greater than sign. Now the greater than sign says that if number 1 is greater than number 2, if this is true, this anything inside this should be printed out. But if it is false, then this else, anything under this else or inside this else should be printed out. So let's run this code to see whether number 1 is actually greater than number 2. Okay, so it says, okay, let us change the output here. Number 1 is greater instead of equal to, so we put greater. So here is number 1 is less than number 2. Okay, so let's run this code. Here it says number 1 is greater I said to the it's supposed to be than number 2. Okay, so is greater than number 2. Let's run again. Number 1 is greater than number 2. So let's check whether it is true. So number 1 is 12 and number 2 is 11. So 12 is greater than 11. So that is why this guy printed out. Now let's put another one here right now. So 111 and 12. You can see that 111 is greater than 12. Okay, but here you are asking if this number 1, which has 12, whether it is greater than number 2, which has 111. So let's see what is going to be printed out. So it's printed out number 1 is less than number 2, which is what is here. So number 1 is 12 and number 2 is 11. Okay, so you can see that the only time this prints out is when it is true, and only when this prints out is when it is false. So right now it is false. Why? Because number 1 is never greater than number 2. Okay, so that is that for the greater than sign. Proceed to the less than sign. The less than sign is the opposite of the greater than sign. Now we are now asking if number 1 is less than number 2. So is number 1 less than number 2? Yes, number 1 is 12 and number 2 is 111. Okay, so 111 is number 2 and 12 is number 1. So this will print true, and when it gives us true, this is going to be printed out. So number 1 is less than number 2. Then here is going to be number 2 is greater than number 1. Okay, so let's run this. Okay, number 1 is less than number 2. So you can see this is what's happened, what's printed out, because this evaluates to true. This gave us true. This condition is true. Number 1 is less than number 2. But if we added something else that is higher than number 2, then let's run and see what is going to be printed out. Then number 2 is greater than number 1. Let's see, number 2 is greater than, okay, we changed this, we have to change it back again. Is less than, number 2 is less than number 1. Okay, so let's run this. So you can see number 2 is less than number 1. Then let's check, this is number 2, which is 111, while number 1 is 122. So number 2 is less than number 1. So that is how we use the greater than sign and the less than sign. Okay, it compares two values or two or more values, then and it will evaluate if it is true, the if statement will run. If it is false, the else statement is going to run. Okay, let's proceed to the greater or equal to. Greater than or equal to. So this is how to write greater than equal to. Remember that this is the sign of greater than sign, and this is the sign of equal to. Okay, equality. But this is the full equality sign, but we are giving it one other relational operator, which is the greater than sign. So this translates to greater than or equal to. So this is how to check whether number 1 is greater than or number 1 is equal to number 2. So now that our number 1 is 122 and our number 2 is 111, number 1 is actually greater than number 2, but is not equal to number 2. So this will actually print this for us. Instead of us to print this again, let's just print true. Let's print true. Then here let's print false. Okay, so if this condition is true, this true will be printed out. If it is false, this false will be printed out. Now we are now asking if number 1 is greater than or equal to number 2. So number 1 is greater than but not equal to. So as far as one condition is satisfied, true is going to be printed out. Let's check. So you can see true has been printed out. Why? Because a condition has been satisfied, which is greater than. Let's go back to 12. Now number 1 is not greater than or equal to number 2 again. So let's run this. So you can see it printed out false, which means that number 1 is not greater than or even equal to number 2. The two conditions didn't meet. Okay, that is why it returned false. But if one condition meets, it will return true. Now let's change this number 1 to the same thing with number 2. So we want to try this equality sign here. This equality sign. Now let's run this. So you can see it gave us true. So that means if number 1 is not even greater than number 2, but as far as it is equal to number 2, it will return true. Okay. Likewise, the less than sign. This less than sign says, is number 1 less than equal to number 2? If this number 1 is less than number 2, but not equal to it, but only less than it, it will print out true. And again, if it is not less than, if it is actually greater than, but it is equal to, okay, if it is not less than but only equal to number 2, like what we have here, is not less than number 2 but equal to number 2, so this will also print true. The only time this will print false is when number 1 is greater than number 2 but not equal to number 2. That is when it will print false. But right now it's going to print true. Let's run again. So you can see true. Now let's add a number here that makes number 1 greater than number 2. Remember the condition. The condition is if number 1 is less than or equal to number 2. So you can see false, which means number 1 is not less than and is not even equal to number 2. That is why this guy printed out. This is how to use a relational operator. If you don't understand, go to the comment box, drop your questions. I will answer you in due course. Please, if you find this educative, informative, please subscribe, turn on the notification bell for new videos, share and like. Thank you very much.